Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second day of the Clifton Literary Festival. I am Merve Emre. I'm a professor of English literature and a contributing writer at the New Yorker magazine. And I am beyond honored and delighted to be in conversation with the legendary Elif Shafak. Can we just get around?
Thank you so much.
Elif is the author of 21 books. She is a tireless and fearsome crusader for the rights of women and human beings around the world. She is a role model, and I am very pleased to call her a friend. Today, we are going to do something a little bit different. Last year at the same festival, Elif and I talked about her wonderful recent novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky. And I thought today we could do something a little more playful and panoramic. So I would like to take you and Elif through her entire career by reading the first sentence of 8 of her novels to her and having her free associate in response to those first sentences so that we can all take a trip down memory lane together. And my hope is that this will bring to light the many, many, many interesting themes and topics that have united your fiction and your nonfiction over the past 2 decades. So let us begin with The Gaze, written originally in Turkish and translated masterfully into English by Brendan Freely, I believe. Here is the first sentence of The Gaze. I was dreaming about a flying balloon. What were you thinking when you wrote that sentence, Elif? Do you remember?
Well, Merve, may I first say what a joy, what a pleasure for me to share the same stage with you. And I so appreciate that you came. I'm also very much looking forward to your thoughts, any questions. If anything I say doesn't make sense, let's talk together. Really looking forward. It's amazing. I mean, when I look back, years ago, Gaze was written. I wrote my first 4 novels in Turkish, and then about 20 years ago, I switched. As you can hear in my accent, I am not a native speaker. English for me is an acquired language. I'm an immigrant in the UK. I'm also an immigrant in the English language. And at some point, I'd love to talk a little bit about, how language changes us. So The Gaze was written in Turkish, and I was very interested in this question of the gaze, but in every different sense, like the gaze of patriarchy, the gaze of society, God as a gaze, as a celestial gaze. I spent a summer next to my grandmothers, both grandmothers. My parents were getting a divorce, and these 2 women were very different. Their interpretation of religion was very different. And what I remember from my experience, my stay with my paternal grandmother, was that in her worldview, God was a celestial gaze that would never blink. And I remember how terrified I was with that, thought. Because if he never blinks, he sees everything, even when you're in the bathroom, as a child. And I remember coming to the other maternal grandmother and telling her about this, and she was very different. She was a very kind human being, and her understanding of faith was centered around love, not fear. That makes a huge difference. And I remember her jokingly telling me, don't worry, I'm sure God has more important things than watching you all the time. But even that little humor was a relief. So all I'm trying to say is, coming back to the novel, when you feel a little bit different, this could be for any reason, the color of your skin, how you look to other people, your identity in the eyes of other people, and so on. Societies that do not celebrate diversity, multiplicity in particular, can be quite oppressive in their gaze, right? And so for those who feel a little bit pushed to the margins, that gaze is not an easy thing to deal with. And I wrote about the relationship of 2 people who looked very different in the eyes of the society, and how we judged difference in Turkey in particular at the time. That was the starting point for me.
It's interesting to hear you say that it was the gaze of God that most powerfully affected you through your grandmother's when you were a child. Whose gaze or what kind of gaze do you feel on you most powerfully now? How has that changed since you wrote that first sentence about ascending up in a balloon toward God's gaze versus sitting here now?
I mean, I think I'm always cognizant of this, or I try to be. When you happen to be a storyteller from a country like Turkey, so we're talking about a country that, of course, has a very rich history and a long history, but that does not necessarily translate into strong memory. If anything, I think it's quite the opposite. We're a society of collective amnesia. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And when you have that kind of a void, usually that absent space, that space is filled in with ultra-nationalistic, sometimes ultra-religious, imperial nostalgia that talks about what a great empire we were all the time. But then you start asking questions. You ask, well, what was the empire like for women? Where are the stories of women? And there's a big silence. What was the empire like for Christian minorities, for Jewish minorities, for an Arab peasant, for a Greek sailor, for an Armenian silversmith? Then there's a big silence. So the reason I mention this is because I'm very interested in silences as well as stories. And so when I was writing The Gaze, of course, as a writer, you evolve, you change. But maybe one thing that has been constant in my life is this desire to also pay attention to silences, not only to stories.
And to imagine your way into those silences when there's no record. Because, of course, that's the very definition of those silences. Nobody else has written into that space. I actually think the first sentence of your next novel, The Flea Palace, speaks to this preoccupation of yours. People say I have a fanciful mind, probably the most tactful way ever invented of saying you're talking nonsense. So, how much do you feel when you are trying to speak into those silences that you are being fanciful, that you are dreaming, or do you ever worry that you are talking nonsense?
Well, that's, the beauty of literature and arts, isn't it? One of the reasons why I love it so much, in particular the novel as a genre, because I always associate it with freedom. There are things maybe you can't say in the same way in your daily life, but when we enter a novel, then it just blurs those boundaries. I think it's very unfortunate that in the English language we use the word fiction as if it were the opposite of facts, right? It gives us the impression that fiction is not interested in reality. Like if we want to escape this very troubling world, we can just pick up a novel and read. That's not how I see literature. Literature for me is not an escape from reality. I think fiction is very interested in the truth. And it does bring us closer to truth, but it does it in its own gentle and profound way. And it does it by dismantling dualities. We are all born into one corner of the universe, a certain ethnicity, class, identity, faith or no faith, and so on. And we're so used to looking at the world from that perspective. But when we read a novel for a few hours, for a few days, for a few weeks, we literally journey into the existence of someone else. And I think that's a very humbling exercise for the mind and for the soul. So I like the origin, etymological origin of the word empathy. Empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is not pity, definitely. The more Germanic origin, Einfühlung, in which you journey, you leave your comfort zone. So I think that's what I wanted to get at when I wrote The Flea Palace.
I can't believe I don't know this. What is the Turkish word for fiction?
Kurgu. It's you just made up.
Made up. Okay. Do you feel like, something I think about myself quite a bit, do you feel like being Turkish but no longer living in Turkey has given you a different angle on the question of identity? I mean, do you feel more pluralistic, innately pluralistic being Turkish but also not living there?
Yeah, I really appreciate that we're talking about this because it's a question that matters to me a lot. I do think a lot about identity, but I don't want to perceive identity as a solid, monolithic block, you know? But the world we're living in constantly tells us that we have to stay in one box once and for all, like choose our side and stay there. Whereas I think as human beings, we all have, as Walt Whitman said so beautifully, we all have multitudes. The problem is we live in a world in which we're not allowed to celebrate our own multitudes. So when I look at myself, of course, being Turkish is a big part of my writing, you might say my identity, and it is very visible, you know, in my books. But at the same time, I feel very attached to the Balkans. So if you put me next to a Greek author or a Bulgarian author, I think I have a lot in common with them. But equally, I have elements in my soul from the Middle East, and I will always carry those elements with me. So again, put me next to a Jordanian author, a Syrian author, I have so much in common with them. I, at the same time, think I am European, you know, by birth, the values that I share. I've become British over the years. I do feel very attached to this country. And despite what politicians have been telling us during particularly Brexit saga, I would like to call myself a citizen of the world. It doesn't mean that if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. That's what we have been told, and I disagree with that, right? So if we could only think of identity as like ripples in water, and there were ancient Greek philosophers who thought about identity in those terms, not as mutually exclusive categories, but ripples in water. It's very understandable for us to feel attached to our ancestors, the land where we come from, the city we live in, but the circles become bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we're all citizens of one human race. So that kind of thinking is not encouraged in the world we live in, but I think inside literature, there is room for that.
What would it take for us to collectively export that understanding from the world of the novel into the world that we live in? What would be if you could remake the world we live in after the principles of the novels you write, what would that world look like?
Well, I think this is an important question, particularly right now, because we are faced with massive global challenges, whether it's climate crisis, widening inequalities, whether it's international terrorism. It shows us that we are all connected, and we have to deal with these challenges together. We have to put our heads together, but we're trying to respond to these challenges by doing the exact opposite, going into more tribalism, more isolationism, as if we close the door, we can leave climate crisis outside the door. There is no such thing. So I think primarily what the novel does as a genre is to show us the connections. I'm not talking about inventing connections. Umberto Eco has a wonderful essay about this. He says the novelist's job is not to create connections, even imagine connections. We just have to see the existing connections because they're already out there. So that's, I believe, our starting point, that as human beings, we are connected, not only with each other beyond borders, but also with nature, with trees, with water. We're not above nature, we're not outside of nature. We've turned ourselves into consumers of nature, thinking we're the superior species, but actually we're a very small part of a very delicate ecosystem. One day human beings might disappear from the face of Earth, mountains will continue to exist, right? So we need to change our perspective a little bit. And the third connection that I find important is the inner one. I call that the inner garden. And I think it's also very important that we reconnect with our own inner garden and keep that alive.
Can you say more about that? What is that inner garden for you? How do you connect with it?
So when I used to live in Turkey, I wrote a children's book which gave me a chance to go to schools and have a talk with very young readers. I'm talking about 6 years old, 7 years old. And if you speak to a young Turkish child or a Jordanian or an Egyptian or a Moroccan child at that age, they're no different whatsoever than a Canadian or a French or a Norwegian child. Children at that age, they have so much chutzpah, they have so much creativity, so much confidence, right? And interestingly, girls at that age are very talkative. They're a little bit more, talkative than boys. And if you ask in a room full of young students, are there any artists in this room? So many hands go up. They're already artists. Are there any writers? Hands up. They call themselves writers and poets and artists. But then I would go and give talks to 16-year-old, 17-year-old Turkish students. And everything is different now. Everything has changed. Now, if you ask in a room full of teenagers, are there any writers in this room? Nobody puts their hands up. Nobody calls themselves poets. And interestingly, girls have become timid. They don't want to talk in the public space. Why? Because we told them, you need to watch out. How you sit, the length of your skirt, whether you're wearing sleeveless, how you laugh, the tone of your voice, you will be judged. Not only you will be judged, but you will be put in a box. So little by little, I think we kill that inner creativity that we're all born with. We talk about talent as if it's something that only a few people have. We all are talented. But the issue is we are taught to kill our creativity, kill our talents, little by little. So I think the primary requisite of being a writer or an artist is to reconnect with that inner garden and make sure it's alive and green and flourishing.
And one thing I'm just thinking as you're speaking is that the gaze of the novel, unlike the gaze of a punishing God or the gaze of the patriarchy or the gaze of the state, the gaze of the novel allows that creativity to flourish.
Yes.
It's a different way of looking.
Because I think inside the novel, it's not about judging, it's not about judgments. I don't like it when writers try to teach something. I don't like it when writers try to preach. I find that quite off-putting, actually. I believe a writer's job is not to try to give the answers, let alone dictate the answers. But the writer's job is to ask questions and to care about the questions, including difficult questions, including taboos, silences. So if I can create a space of plurality, multiplicity, nuance, and then I have to take a step back and leave the answers to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers. No two readings are ever the same. I've met couples who've been married for 45 years. They read the same novel, but they don't read it in the same way. Maybe the wife likes it, the husband not so much. Or two friends who share everything, they read the same novel, but they feel connected, attached to very different characters. Why? Because the reader is not passive, the reader brings their own gaze. So I have to respect that diversity. You cannot impose your own judgment as an author, but you have to create a space of freedom and nuance, and that's something I care about.
What do you think the most difficult question is that a novel of yours has asked?
I mean, I really don't know, because immediately, the moment you ask me this, as a Turkish writer, immediately I think about how words can be heavy in Turkey, Whatever you write, whatever you touch, from sexuality to gender to history to politics, you offend the authorities. So words are heavy, and I think being a women novelist is a little bit heavier. Because you have to deal with additional layers of sexism and misogyny. You will not be reviewed in the same way. You will not be seen in the same way. We are a patriarchal society that respects matriarchs, meaning grandmothers. Women are respected only, or mostly, when they are seen as old in the eyes of the society, right? So you go through all those phases. I mean, I was put on trial in Turkey for writing a novel called The Bastard of Istanbul, which was a very surreal experience. In a way, I found myself on trial with fictional characters because their words had been plucked, taken out of the book. And that madness went on for a year, during which time there were groups on the streets burning EU flags, burning my pictures, spitting at my pictures, calling me a traitor, because that book talks about the Armenian genocide. And then 2 other books, maybe we'll talk about them, have been investigated this time for the crime of obscenity. So I give you these examples because something that is not controversial in my eyes might become controversial within that political climate.
I mean, there's this very strange standard in Turkey of offending Turkishness as being the criterion for determining whether to prosecute an author or not. You and Orhan Pamuk have both been prosecuted for offending Turkishness. And even as I say it, there's something absurd about both of these words placed next to one another. Where does it come from? How can you prosecute writers for this particular kind of offense? And tell me more about the insanity of the kind of reader who would read a novel and not recognize something a character is saying is not the same as the author's own ideological or political position.
I think absurd is the right word, you know. It was for me an unsettling experience, I cannot deny that, because it was completely unexpected. We have an article in the Turkish constitution that protects Turkishness against insults, but nobody knows quite what that means. And in that way, it's quite open to misinterpretation. So this article had been used against scholars, mostly against journalists and historians, but never before against a fiction writer. So that was the first time with the Bastard of Istanbul, and that was very unexpected. But as I said, you know, it could be anything that, I wish I could say that things got easier and better, but we have been seeing a big crackdown on freedom of speech and freedom of imagination. If you don't have these things, because that's our oxygen as writers, if a story takes you in that direction, you should be able to follow it. If you start worrying, well, if I touch this subject, will the authorities get offended? Then you will fall into the trap of self-censorship. And I think self-censorship is a very important subject. We don't talk about it enough, but we must. We must have honest conversations. Maybe the only thing that helps me personally is when I'm writing a novel, I try to forget the real world, and I try to stay in my imaginary world as long as I can, as deep as I can. So those characters become my friends. They become my companions. Only when the book is over and I hand it to my editor, then I get panic attacks. Then I start worrying, but by then it's too late, the book is born and it has its own life, the way it should be. It should be independent of all these worries, but definitely independent of self-censorship.
So you're up in a balloon dreaming until you have to come back down to earth. You know, I want to get back to what you said about connection and that wonderful metaphor that you offered us of throwing the pebble into the river and the circles widening and rippling out, because it's actually the metaphor that opens your wonderful novel, Aşk.
Yes, the 40 rules of
Yes, the 40 rules of love. Between your fingers you hold a stone and throw it into flowing water. And then that paragraph goes on to describe the ripples that stone creates and how you can't quite tell where the ripples might ever end. That metaphor and the whole system of water is particularly important for you. There are rivers in the sky, in the beginning of 40 Rules of Love, and it has this ecological charge. So talk to us about the way that water becomes a way to unearth those connections that are in the world that the novel is surfacing but not making, as you said.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I think you know, earlier we touched upon these connections. I am very interested in ecofeminism, if I may put it this way, the kind of feminism that also wants to understand social inequalities and maybe try to join the dots. But beyond that, I believe we've entered an age in which we cannot be single-issue people. If I may give you an example, I say this, we're talking here about water as to writers from Turkish background. Now, when I look at the Middle East in general, this is a region that is experiencing acute water scarcity. Today, out of the most 10 water-stressed nations, 7 of them are in the Middle East and in North Africa. And what that means is that our rivers are dying. It's so visible. In general, across the world, when we talk about climate crisis, we are talking about primarily fresh water scarcity. But in some parts of the world, it's easy to forget this, whereas in the Middle East, you cannot forget it. It is right happening in front of your eyes. So this has massive consequences. It increases political violence. It increases economic inequalities, social inequalities. But I think it's primarily women, children, and the poor who are at the moment carrying this burden in a disproportionate way. And if I may give you an example, women usually are water carriers in traditional societies. When there's no drinkable water nearby, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility for sexual violence. So in our minds, we put these things in separate drawers. Here is the box for climate crisis, there's another drawer for water scarcity, maybe another drawer for women's rights, another drawer for racial inequality, and so on. But in life, there are no drawers. In life, there are no boxes, and water reminds us that everything is connected.
I was thinking about this summer because I was in Turkey. I was in Çeşme, which is right on the western coast of the country, right across from the Greek island of Chios, and Chios was on fire.
Yep.
So I'm sure you all have been reading about the wildfires that have spread throughout Europe this summer. Chios was on fire, and then Alaçatı, the peninsula next to us, was also on fire. So we were completely surrounded by fire, and the winds were so strong that the helicopters that normally fight the fires couldn't. And then there were all these news reports of women sneaking into the yards of people who had pools, hooking up hoses into the pools and fighting the fires themselves. And so I was thinking about there are rivers in the sky as I was watching this and thinking, oh, in an era of climate catastrophe, look at the women on the front lines coming up with all these nifty ways of fighting the crisis themselves. And in some ways, that's what there are rivers in the sky is all about too.
Yeah, that's very interesting because women have been at the forefront, also in terms of protecting trees, forests, more aware of the dangers of deforestation. But this is happening at a massive scale. I mean, in 2030, which is not that far from now, Kabul, Afghanistan's capital, is going to become the first big city without any water left. More than 6 million people live in Kabul right now. So as humanity, we have to invest in water. We have to invest in drinkable water and encourage ourselves to do that. Today, even in Scotland, even in Wales, I mean, parts of the world that people thought would never experience water scarcity, we are talking about water scarcity. So that's one thing. The other thing is I wonder sometimes, do we ever learn from history? You know, we like to believe that time is always linear, progressive. We want to believe that the arc of history will bend towards justice, but that is a narrative, right? It doesn't necessarily work like that way. So we have to question this notion of linear history. When I follow the journey of a river, of a tree, of a mountain, actually it's much more cyclical. If I may give you an example, when I look at the river Thames, it's fascinating what this river has achieved, because we're talking about a zombie river. Why a zombie? Because not that long ago, the Thames was dead. 150 years ago, it was declared biologically dead. And the assumption back then was, this river is so filthy because of the way we human beings mistreated it, that nothing ever will live in this water again. But fast forward, here we are, and the Thames is home to more than 200 biospecies, maybe even more. But right now, as we're speaking, water companies, in the name of money, in the name of greed, in the name of profit, once again, they're pumping sewage into the same waterway. So it makes you question how much progress have we made as humanity, and why don't we respect the river and what it has achieved in terms of renewal.
It also makes you question what the individual can do, whether as a political actor or activist or as a novelist. And what you're saying about cyclicality, women, nature, reminds me of the first sentence of your novel, 3 Daughters of Eve. It was an ordinary spring day in Istanbul, a long and leaden afternoon like so many others, when she discovered, with a hollowness in her stomach, that she was capable of killing someone.
Yeah.
So, how do your characters discover the capacity for extraordinary action, whether for good or evil,
Yeah.
in the face of extraordinary oppression?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. You know, I don't believe in heroes. I don't believe in absolute evil or absolute good. I think we're all a mixture, right? It's just in different degrees. And our job as human beings is to try to minimize the destructive side in us and hopefully expand the good in us. And that's a lifelong learning. So it's those shades in between that I'm very interested in. But again, literature, I think, can do this well. We're interested in the moment when a very brave person suddenly loses their courage. Or the opposite, a person who's very shy and timid, maybe all their lives, they never, could find their voice or could find their feet. But there comes a moment in their life when that person will make the right choice and will behave in a very bold and brave way. It can happen. So you need to capture, you need to understand. It's the unseen under the seen surface that I'm always interested in.
Why murder? In that novel, in particular, why begin with murder?
I think it's rather than murder being maybe the center of that novel, at least for me personally, I wanted to question these absolute certainties. That's something that scares me a lot. People who are very sure of their truths, like someone who's ultra-religious, to such an extent that they want to get rid of doubt. I think faith without doubt is a dogma, and dogmas are very, very dangerous. But the very opposite, someone who is very confident of their atheism, another absolute certainty, that also tries to get rid of faith. Faith is an interesting thing. Faith can also be very secular. It doesn't have to be religious. For instance, when you move to a different city, you don't know if you're going to be happy there, but something tells you to do it, and you do it. That's a secular act of faith. When we fall in love with someone, we don't quite know if that's the right person for us, but we follow our gut instinct. That's a secular act of faith. When you start writing a novel, you don't know whether you're going to succeed, you don't know where the story is going to take you. It's a secular act of faith. So I like it when faith and doubt can talk to each other, can dance together. If you separate them, it goes into extremes, and that seems dangerous to me. I was interested in this book in agnosticism, or in the kind of mystics who were a little bit like misfits. Mystics who were misfits, they were walking a very thin line between faith and doubt, and I wanted to delve into that.
Well, it's your two grandmothers right there
It's
again,
to my
isn't it? Yeah,
grandmothers,
it's all the way through all of the novels. I want to get back to what you said about women and cyclicality, and I'm cheating a little bit when I read the first line of, gosh, these lights are, I need to do this. When I read the first line of 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, because I'm going to read the dedication instead of the first line. The dedication of that novel is to the women of Istanbul and to the city of Istanbul, which is and has always been a she city. What does it mean for a city to be a she city, especially one so imprinted with the history of the empire and its massive bureaucratic apparatus?
Well, remember earlier we talked about this collective amnesia. We walk across Istanbul and we forget its history. That history is very complicated, layers upon layers, going all the way back to, of course, the Ottoman Empire, but also Byzantine Empire, and before. It is the oldest urban settlement in Europe. So there are lots of stories that are untold. And it's a city that constantly mixes everything. Istanbul doesn't say, okay, this is the neighborhood of the East, this is the neighborhood of the West, and here's the happy moment and here's the sad moment. Istanbul doesn't do that. What it does is it mixes everything constantly, wildly. So in Istanbul, you might come across a very sad moment, but underneath there's an element of absurd. Or you might come across something really funny, but there's a trace of melancholy inside. So it's that kind of city that blends everything. That novel, the one we're talking about, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in the strange world, the beginning was this idea, this scientific research that shows after we die, after the human heart has stopped beating, the mind, the brain remains alive for a few more minutes, sometimes up to 10 minutes. So the entire structure is based on that. Right away, it's an unusual beginning because right away we know that the main character in this novel is dead. She's a sex worker, she's been murdered. There had been a similar murder in Istanbul at the time, and that's how everything began in my mind. And her heart has stopped beating, but her mind is still working. So as she remembers her, in a way, life, we journey into her story. But I need to very quickly add something. The second idea that inspired that book was an actual graveyard, which exists in Istanbul on the outskirts of the city. We call this cemetery the cemetery of the companionness. It is like no other cemetery because there are no marble tombstones, there are no names on the graves, there are no surnames, no flowers, no visitors, nothing. There are only wooden placards with numbers scribbled on them. It is a place where human beings are turned into numbers. And when, because of the winter, rain, snow, those numbers disappear, everything disappears. So who is buried in this place, which is expanding, growing very fast? For instance, during 1980s and 1990s, people who died of HIV-related sicknesses, diseases, they were buried there because of the stigma of AIDS. They were not given any proper burial. Or abandoned babies found dead on the streets, or sex workers. Many LGBTQ plus community individuals, because if they have been rejected by their families. Then there are many refugees, for instance, Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, who have lost their lives as they were trying to come to Turkey or come to Europe. Where are all these bodies buried? So it's a very unusual place where unlikely people are buried side by side and they all become numbers. And I think my instinct as a writer was, can I at least take one of those numbers and reverse the process and try to show that these people were not companions. So it's a book that focuses on water families. Not blood families, but water families.
You're making me think, too, of your earlier book, which I didn't read, the first sentence of Honor, which is about an honor killing, and how many ways there are to treat people not only in life, but also in death that refuses to honor them, and how part of the project of the novels that you write is a practice of honoring, not just recuperating voices from silences, but also figuring out how to honor them. What does that word mean to you? How do you think about honoring people who have been dishonored by the world?
Yeah, I so appreciate this. It's a very crucial concept in Turkish culture, isn't it? I mean, I always pay attention to how we drink in different cultures. Sometimes we raise our glasses to each other's health. In Turkish, we raise our glasses to each other's honor. So it's not health, it's not happiness, it's honor. We name our children honor, but never girls. It's always boys who are honor. So these are the things that I want to unpack. I think we look for honor in the wrong places. And we associate women's bodies, women's sexuality, women's behavior with the opposite of honor, dishonor. So that is something that needs to change. But one of the things that I try to do in that novel is also look at how we, as mothers, raise our own sons. There's a lot of pressure on young boys in very patriarchal settings. because we raise them sometimes as little sultans in the family. We treat them differently, but we also teach them that they need to keep an eye on the honor of the family, on the behavior of their sisters. It's a straight jacket that we put on, you know, and I find that problematic as well. So I try to write about a mother-son relationship. It does also talk about immigrant experience, that novel, but basically I wanted to unpack that concept of honor.
This is just anecdotal, but you're reminding me that when I was trying to name my sons, I couldn't find a Turkish, or I had a lot of trouble finding a Turkish name that didn't mean warrior.
Yeah.
Or conqueror, right, or rock, and they all have these hard, exactly, back, you know, they all have these sort of hard militaristic, highly patriarchal names, and it took me forever to find two names that I could live with, okay, the last line of the novel that preceded There Are Rivers in the Sky, The Island of Missing Trees. Again, I'm cheating a little bit. Here is the dedication. To immigrants and exiles everywhere, the uprooted, the rerouted, the rootless, and to the trees we left behind, rooted in our memories. As I was reading this, I kept thinking about the great literary critic, György Lukács, Hungarian literary critic, who believed that the novel was fundamentally a genre of homelessness. That the characters in novels are estranged from the world around them, and the whole drama of the novel is trying to find a way to reconcile an individual's innermost life with a world that refuses it at every turn. So talk to me about the immigrants, the exiles, the uprooted, the rerouted, and the rootless as they weave their way or are rerouted in your books.
Thank you, Merve. It's a difficult question for me, to be honest, because these are concepts that I think about a lot. And they're not issues that you can solve in your mind and put it in your pocket and leave behind. So it keeps coming with me, but I care a lot about the concept of home. Where is home? Can we have multiple homes? Can we have portable homelands? Do we leave our motherlands behind when we are miles and continents away? Or do we carry them with us? Do they seep into our dreams? Because I think they do. But also, what does it mean to be an immigrant, to be an exile? You know, all these concepts keep dancing in my mind. There are no easy solutions. I think about the concept of roots, and I would rather think of roots not necessarily as something buried in the ground, but almost like an upside-down tree, like a baobab tree, right? Imagine the roots up in the air. Can we draw air and oxygen and sunlight and water from infinity, from openness, rather than just thinking of one specific buried ground? So I want to rethink the notion of roots. There is a melancholy, I think, to the existence, because it's a fractured existence, the one of an immigrant. But at the same time, you learn so much, you grow so much. And the novel, I fully agree, can hold all these questions inside, starting with the notion of homelessness.
Do you feel, when's the last time you have felt existentially homeless? Do you feel at home in the world, in this country now?
Yes, I do feel at home in the UK. This country became my home. The English language became my home. But I also, and I really mean this, I think Storyland is my home. I started writing fiction at a young age, not because I was planning to become a novelist. There were no such role models around me. I didn't know such a thing was possible. Basically, I started writing fiction because I thought life was very boring. I was an only child raised by a single mom. And to me, Storyland, which in Turkish we associate with mountain kaf. So if you can go beyond the mountain kaf, there's a much more interesting world out there, more colorful, and I wanted to journey into that space. If I may quickly add this, I think the way we teach creative writing, usually in workshops, courses across universities, it troubles me a little bit because we always start with this notion, write what you know, which is admirable, which is important, But literature cannot be reduced to only that. Write what you feel is bigger than that, right? Then we're talking about the transcendental nature of literature, not only autobiographical nature of literature, which I admire and I love, but I think the transcendental aspect is not encouraged enough, especially if you happen to be a women writer or a writer from outside the West, or a minority background writer. There is a certain expectation that we should be writing, particular stories that fit our identity. But for me, literature is not only that. It's a desire to go beyond boxes. For instance, if you're an Afghan women writer, you're not expected to write science fiction or avant-garde fiction or experimental fiction. You have to write about the problems of women in Afghanistan. But please don't get me wrong, it is so important to write about what Afghan women are going right now. And I think their voices need to be amplified for sure. But my point is, an Afghan novelist might write about this subject in one book. Maybe her next novel is going to be something completely different. So that kind of freedom to go beyond boxes and is something that we're not encouraged to do. So there are lots of glass walls within the publishing world too.
It's interesting. I mean, I think I immigrated at a younger age than you did. And one of the things that's fascinating to me is I actually have very little understanding of my parents' own backgrounds. And I've started interviewing them now, and it makes me realize that my own history is in fact an alien land. That I know not very much about the 1970s in Istanbul and the battles on the streets between the ultra-right and the Maoists, and my mother was one. So there's, I wonder if you have something similar, that as an immigrant you're in this strange position of, one, not wanting to write what you're being culturally conscripted to write, but at the same time finding these pockets of deep unknowing in your own history.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm very intrigued by this, because any family, not only immigrant families, but any family that has experienced some kind of complexity, displacement, I think there are generational differences in the way we deal with memory and forgetting. Usually the elderly are the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships, but they do not talk about the past. It doesn't mean they have forgotten the past, it just sits inside their chest, unspoken, all those words. So they don't talk about the past. The next generation usually doesn't talk about the past that much. Understandably, they don't have the time for it. They need to find their feet, tabula rasa. It has to be a new beginning. They need to be forward-looking, future-oriented. But that leaves the youngest in these families. The third or the fourth generations are today the ones who are asking the biggest questions about ancestral heritage. Not only family stories, but also family silences. And sometimes in a family there are 4 siblings, but only one of them does the memory keeping, not the others. Why is it like that, right? I would like to hope and believe that writers are the memory keepers of their societies, of their eras, not because we want to be stuck in the past, but unless we study the past with all its beauties, complexities, atrocities, we really as human beings cannot grow. We cannot repair, and what we don't repair will keep coming back. So I think memory is an important part of healing, both for individuals, but also for societies.
I'm going to turn it to the audience for questions. Yes, we have one immediately over here. Wow, that hand popped up so quickly. Let's take you. Yes. What's your name?
I'm Jasmine. Thank you so much for this really wonderful and very intimate and open, honest conversation. I want to kind of continue this last question that you just discussed, because I felt very seen by what you said today, Elif, especially with regards to thinking a lot about grandmothers and thinking a lot about identity and how it ties to language and home and all of that. I write in English despite it not being my mother tongue, so you get me. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little more, sort of. How did it feel for you you said you made English a home in a way, and I feel very much that way too, but I also like know that for me it was like a process over many years, sort of the struggle of sort of like engaging with the language to the extent that you can write literature in it. That is sort of like it takes a lot of engagement with the language that a native speaker might not necessarily have.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how was that for you? Was it a challenge? Was it a challenge that you welcomed? Could you talk a bit about perhaps like what English offers you that Turkish doesn't, and vice versa as well?
Yeah.
Are you a different writer if you write in those
Next
different
year,
languages?
we should have this conversation in Turkish.
Oh.
And then this question will be answered by what the audience does in response to us speaking a language you all can't understand. So, yes.
I so appreciate your words. I mean, there's such different languages. The journey from Turkish into English is, I don't know if you would agree, Marvi, but it's really, really hard. Everything is different. Vocabulary is different. The grammar is different. In English, I say I read a book. In Turkish, I say a book read I. And it's completely different. I mean, where you put the verb, where you put the nouns, everything is different. And to be honest, it was a big, big challenge for me. When I used to write in Turkish primarily, people could recognize my writing instantly because I used lots of old words, Ottoman words, and new words. That's a big issue in Turkey. If you're a liberal, modern, whatever that means, person, you're expected to use modern words. If you're a conservative, you're expected to use old words. I've never understood that duality. I think as human beings, we need all the words, right? Because they're not the same. We need all nuances. As you know, in Turkey, we have Turkified our language because the Ottoman Empire was multilingual, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. As a result, in the language, the syntax was Turkish, but the vocabulary was a combination of Arabic, Persian, Ladino, Armenian, Kurdish. So when you Turkify, I can say yellow in Turkish and I can say red, but I don't have words for the shades in between because they used to come from Persian.
Altan, it's my younger son's name. Red gold.
Oh, I see.
Sorry.
That's
It just comes back to what we were
There you
talking
go.
about. So anyway, sorry.
There you go. So in English, when you speak and you say kısmet, or when you say chutzpah, nobody says, well, you know, the first is an Arabic word, the second it comes from Hebrew. Nobody says that because organically part of the English language. I like that. I appreciate that. But all I'm trying to say is I love language. And for someone, I don't see language as an instrument, you know, that I put aside. I see it as a space I enter and I inhale. And it affects us, it changes us. For someone like me to leave Turkish behind, honestly, it felt like cutting my hand. And I had to refine my voice, my literary voice. You become nobody, and then you have to start all over from scratch. At the same time, the English language gave me freedom. I still love both languages dearly, and I'm always interested in how we switch depending on our emotions. You know, I have Italian friends who, when they're angry, they immediately switch back to Italian. That's always interesting, but in a nutshell, my connection with English is more cerebral. My connection with Turkish is a bit more emotional.
That's a lovely question. Thank you. Yes, right over here.
Hi. Hello? Oh, right. Sorry. Hi, my name is Inje. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I really loved what you said about how two readers can have very different experiences of a book. And I'm curious if there's maybe one book in particular, or maybe in several of your books, where the response from readers in Turkey has been very different from the response from maybe a Western audience, UK or America, just in terms of maybe a theme they latched onto that other audiences found, secondary.
I appreciate the question so much. Maybe I cannot answer it directly because, in my mind, I cannot generalize like Western readers. Does it make sense? Because each and everyone's reading is so different. But I can tell you that, in particular in Turkey, being a novelist is a little bit like kissed on one cheek and being slapped on the other cheek at the same time. So as we talked about, you offend the authorities, but at the same time you can receive a lot of love from people who read. And in countries like Turkey, and my writer friends from India, from Pakistan, and elsewhere tell me it's very similar for them too. A book is not a personal item. If a reader likes a book, they don't put it back on the shelf, they share it. You know, you give it to your neighbor, and the neighbor sends it to her son, who might be doing their military service, compulsory, and so a whole group of soldiers read the same book. And I've seen copies of my books underlined in different colored pens because on average 5 to 6 people read the same copy. Does it make sense? So that kind of word of mouth, sharing stories is incredibly important, and I think that's what keeps novels alive.
We had a hand, yes, right over here.
Hi, my name is Melinda. I love your work. Can I ask you about your process? Because I'm always so impressed by how much historical research you must do in your books, and yet how you wear that so lightly. But also in your day-to-day process of writing, what that day looks like, how that pans out.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. I think I love interdisciplinary thinking. I always believe that the mind is more nourished when we leave our comfort zones. For instance, when a novelist becomes interested in neuroscience or water science, I don't know anything about these fields, but I want to learn if the story takes me in that direction, so you become a student of that field. But equally, when a scientist falls in love with poetry, or when a poet is drawn to film theory, or when a director becomes interested in political philosophy, the moment we leave our atomized comfort zones and journey into another discipline, another way of thinking, I think that's when the mind is more nourished. So I just try to follow where the story is taking me or where my intuition is taking me. But once I know it, I try to read as extensively as I can to give the story my very best. Sometimes learning is not enough, we have to unlearn, because there are so many biases, prejudices that we internalize without even being aware of them. So unlearning is a big part of learning. But then equally I pay attention to oral culture. For instance, when I was writing this novel, I wrote about the Yazidi communities, which is one of the most misunderstood, maligned, and persecuted minorities in the Middle East. They have been slandered throughout centuries, called devil worshippers, quote unquote, by people who have no idea about them. And this is a culture, that's the reason why I'm mentioning it, it's a culture that doesn't have a written holy book. So, and there isn't much written information about them. So if we want to understand the Yazidi culture, we have to pay attention to lullabies, riddles, folk tales, the stories that have been passed on from grandmothers to grandchildren. That means we also need to study oral culture, not only written works. So I try to do those simultaneously, and then there comes a moment when you can fly. After that, I don't read anything. I just only follow my intuition. I don't know where I'm going, but I love it when characters guide me and the story guides me.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, back there. Oh.
Hi, my name.
Oh. Is it not working? Oh, just
Hi, my name is Sasha.
a little more into the microphone.
Hi,
Sorry.
my
There
name
we
is
go.
Sasha. I had a question. Similarly, like you were saying, in my school, 40 Rules of Love was circulated, and we all had different parts of it underlined. My question was that it was really heavily inspired by Sufism. What made you write about Sufism in the way you did in such a universal language?
Well, let me just repeat in case
Yeah,
people,
sure.
what made you write about Sufism? And yes.
Yeah,
what made you write
thank you
about
so
Sufism?
much. I wanted to write about Rumi, whose voice I think is so relevant to our times. You know, sometimes I jokingly think in the Middle East we have these baklava wars and we also have Rumi wars. The Afghans like to believe that Rumi belongs to them because of course his family came from Afghanistan, and there are marvelous stories about how they brought an entire library. It was so important for them as they were migrating to carry their books with them, Rumi's family. But we Turkish people like to believe that Rumi belongs to us, actually, because he lived in Anatolia, so he's our Rumi. And the Persians say, no way, he's not your Rumi, he's our Rumi, because he always wrote in, not always, he also wrote in Greek, but primarily he wrote in Persian. And of course the Greeks say, well, what about the Greek connection? But the beauty of Rumi is that he doesn't belong to a single ethnicity, religion, region, or era. I think there's something so universal, so timeless in his voice. And I am sorry, I feel sad that we lost connection with that voice. We lost connection with those ancient philosophies and ancient poetry. We're so obsessed with novelty as, in this modern age, as if always whatever is new is better than what was old. Of course, we should be open to novelty, but also be aware of what we have lost and what we have left behind. So that was my starting point, and it was a bit of a challenge, to be honest, because as a writer, as I said, I don't believe in heroes. I didn't want to put them on a pedestal, treat them as human beings, which means we're all flawed. Never forget that both Shams and Rumi were human beings, but at the same time, try to understand that ancient philosophy and basically love. These people were very different. In the old scripts, Rumi is described as water, and Shams is described as fire. They loved each other, they transformed each other, and that's why in the book it says if we're the same person before and after we loved, it means we haven't loved enough, because love does change us.
Well, thank you for sharing your universal voice with us, Elif.
Thank you, Mara.